Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Those of you just joining us, welcome. Just want to take a moment to thank all of you today for attending and joining us at the Global Digital Currency conversation that we're hosting here on Bitcoin during the G20 Summit. I also just wanted to take a second to thank all of the fantastic staff who've put this together here today, the venue, and our great team at the Australian Digital Currency Commerce Association. And I'm going to take a second just to introduce Senator Matt Cannavan from Queensland, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable parliamentarians in the country, best placed to be able to say a few words about digital currency and Bitcoin and the promise that lays in front of us. He actually did a thesis a few years ago, I believe, on private banking digital currencies. So without further ado, Senator, thank you very much.
Cheers, mate. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ron. And it's probably one of those awards, being the most knowledgeable politician on this topic, that's not all that hard to get, because I don't think many politicians have much knowledge. I do need to correct, though, I actually didn't do the thesis on digital currencies. It was about 12 years ago. So it was a bit before we've had this boon in interest in Bitcoins and other coins and the internet. Indeed, I remember when I was at university, I struggled to get a connection to the internet, but it was on privately issued currencies by banks or any other institution that may seek to do so. It's been a live economic debate for centuries, not just in recent times. And I might talk a little bit about that tonight. But before I do just want to thank the Australian Digital Currency Commerce Association for inviting me here tonight, Ron and his team. I'm sure going to be joined here by Senator Sam Dastyari soon. His plane has been delayed. Sam has actually been the driving force behind putting together a Senate inquiry into digital currencies. He approached me a few months ago and thought this was a good idea, and given my background and interest in the issue, I agreed. So Sam pushed through some terms of reference. Sam's for those who are not political, a member of the Labor Party in New South Wales. I'm a member of the LNP here in Queensland, but we're both on this committee, and the Senate is a place where you've got to work with other parties. So I think this is an issue which we can have a bipartisan approach to, and try to encourage the development of these types of innovations. As Ron said, I do have an interest in this topic. This beautiful building we're meeting in here tonight is actually owned by the University of Queensland these days, and that's where I went and did my economics degree, and ended up doing an honours degree, and my thesis was about these privately fiat issued currencies, and Senator Dastyari has just walked through, so I'll acknowledge him. And look, I should tell you, what did I find in that thesis? Well, without wanting to engage the scorn of Ron and his team and others here tonight, I actually was a little bit sceptical about the potential for privately issued currencies to be stable. My study was only very narrow. It was an honours thesis, wasn't a PhD. I only looked at fiat-based currencies. That's currencies that are not backed by a commodity or gold, etc., like that. And it was only ones issued by private institutions. And as I said before, it was before we'd heard of bitcoins and all those things. But the principal reason I found that fiat-based private currencies probably wouldn't be a stable and competitive alternative to government-based currencies is that basically the costs of issuing extra currency is zero. If it's a paper currency, it's very, very small value. So there's always an incentive for those people who are issuing that currency to just keep issuing that currency, even if it's only worth a little bit of money, because they'll make a profit. And in the jargon of economics, that's a timing consistency problem, that their incentive today is to do something that will provide a short-term benefit, that is the overissuance of currency. It will come at a long-term cost to their reputation and probably their business, but that short-term benefit's probably going to outweigh the long-term cost. And so in effect, there's no reason to believe perhaps that a private bank would be any more disciplined than Robert Mugabe. But then again, it's probably a bit strange and unusual about why all governments don't act like Robert Mugabe, because they have the same incentives as well. And they have the same incentives to overissue, to increase their tax base, or to pay off their debts if they're in their own currency. And that's what, in the 1970s, this has been a long debate in economics, but in the 1970s, Frederick Hayek, some of you might know of him, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, he reopened this debate. He had a paper saying we should have competition in currencies. We should have privately issued ones. We should have governments compete as well in different countries. And he bluntly put it that with the exception only of the 200-year period of the gold standard, practically all governments of history have used their exclusive power to issue money in order to defraud and plunder the people. And it was reading his paper actually, that got me interested in doing my thesis on this topic. The problem, as I started to research it, though, the problem for Hayek, though, is that there is some experience with privately issued currencies. It's something we've all forgotten about, really. It's not very taught much, but America and Scotland had for a long time, had banks who issued their own currencies. Andrew Jackson in the 1830s got rid of the Second Bank of the United States. Banking has always been a very controversial, wasn't the 19th century, very controversial topic in American politics. And he labelled them a monopoly, and they were defrauding the farmers and hard-working people of the United States and to benefit the financiers. So after his decision in the 1830s, a whole lot of private banks started issuing currency before the Civil War. But they ended up being, it was a real wildcat industry, and inflation was rampant, there was no security in money, and most of that actually occurred in the southern United States where the farming community was stronger. And some people even say it was one of the key reasons why the South wasn't able to win the war, because they lacked financial stability. In Scotland, the record was a little bit better, but then others would argue that Scotland benefited from the fact of having the Bank of England just down the road, and certainly that was Adam Smith's view, that the government should be the one that issues currencies. And that's always struck me as a bit of an irony, that Adam Smith and Milton Friedman and other economists that typically would argue against any form of government monopoly, or indeed any form of government intervention in the economy, actually want and support a sovereign government issuing currency and having a monopoly in that issuing. And Friedman in particular, when he read Hayek's arguments in the 1970s, came out hard against it. He said this was not right. And the reason he said it was not right, or the main reason he said it was not right, was that he felt that switching currencies is just too hard. That when you've set up your whole business, your whole life to transact in a certain currency, it's too hard to change them. I mean, if you don't like the bread you're getting from your baker today, thought it was pretty crummy, you can go to a different baker tomorrow, not much hassle. But changing the currency you transact in is a little bit harder, and therefore, actually, would we actually get effective competition in currencies? And Milton thought no. And as I said in my honest thesis, I basically came down on Milton's side for those reasons, that you'd need to be able to, if banks are going to issue currency, over-issue currency, you need to be able to switch very quickly to prevent them from making excess profits. And I generally don't think that can happen. There was actually a real-world example recently that again is largely unreported. After 1991, Somalia basically lost its government and it lost its central bank, and for a long time it was effectively a stateless area. And there was no officially issued currency. But a few local tribesmen started to issue their own currency. But instead of having their own brand or their own face on the notes, they actually just issued forgeries of the existing Somaliland shilling, all of them, all three of them. And that, of course, led to rampant inflation. It wasn't as bad as Zimbabwe, but none of them felt it was beneficial or profitable to invest in their own brand of currency, probably given because of those switching costs that all people would have to do. But look, despite that negativity, I'm going to finish on a positive note here tonight, because I actually think all those arguments that Milton Friedman put are right. They're probably right, and they've probably been played out in history. But what we've got today is very different than what we had 40 years ago. And I think it'd be fascinating to hear what Milton Friedman would say about bitcoins today. But unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Because bitcoins have a number of characteristics that are very different from those privately issued currencies. Number one, they have a decentralised medium of exchange, and there's not really one person in control necessarily, or one corporation that has those incentives to defraud and act in an ill-disciplined way. But even more importantly, now with a lot of transactions happening over the internet or on your ATMs or basically through numbers, not through hard currency, there are not necessarily the switching issues that there once was. That presumably we could have institutions come forward which make it easy for people to switch between currencies, make it easy to switch between currencies as it is to switch mobile phone companies. That could possibly happen. And if that does happen, well, well, maybe we can have a competitive market in currencies. And I know this conference we're having here today is as a result of the G20, and I haven't really been involved in any capacity this weekend, thank God, but the G20 is a rather new organisation. It basically came about after the global financial crisis. And while it's hard to get economists to agree on anything, let alone the causes of a major economic disruption, the old joke is that if you ask an economist what the economic effects of the French Revolution are, they'll say it's too early to tell. And they're often like that on these things. But there are some very serious people who say that the recent financial crisis was caused by the over-issuing of currency in the US, particularly low interest rates in the US, and fixed currency policies in China. And they're effectively a monetary reason or a monetary cause for that crisis. Now, others also see that the seeds of the next economic crisis are being sown in the massive issuancing of currency and the expansion of balance sheets as a result of quantitative easing. And if that were to happen again, it's a monetary issue that's going to potentially disrupt the economy. So if we can develop private markets and competition in currency, I firmly believe that the benefits to the world would be just as important as the open and liberal trade in products that emerged after World War II and the GATT and WTO. So we should be investigating these options and look and make sure if we can get this to work, it could be a major source of extra stability, liberty and economic choice for people across the world. And, I make this point, we have been lucky in this country to have largely macroeconomic stability, but across the globe that hasn't really been the case. In 1971, Richard Nixon broke the link between gold and the US dollar, and at the time you could buy an ounce of gold for $35 US. Today it's about $1,200. So in 40 years you've had sort of a more than 95% reduction in the value of the US dollar in terms of gold. Now that's quite a mean feat to do it in 40 years, because it took the Romans about 200 years to debase their currency to the same level. We've done it in 40. So it hasn't exactly been all that stable on a global basis. Now if we can reverse that, if we can have a more stable and competitive ability, or put more discipline on governments acting in those ways by having a choice for people, that'd be a great and wonderful thing. So that's why I'm very excited. I said before you came in, Sam, that I did credit you. You're the driving force behind this inquiry, not me. But I am very excited about doing something like this. It's a very humble little Senate inquiry on one corner of the world, but we need to do more of these things, and I applaud the work of Ron and his team to get these issues on the agenda, because I do think they can have a huge global impact. And we in this country have always been a very early adopter of financial innovation, and I hope that can continue with digital currencies as well. Thanks again for having me here tonight, and I'm sure I'll catch up with many of you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Canavan. Next, I'd like to introduce Senator Sam Dastyari. He's the chair of the Senate Economics Committee, who's launched the inquiry into digital currencies such as Bitcoin. I think it's a great opportunity for us to be able to bring out into the open just what some of the risks may be with digital currencies such as Bitcoin, as well as talk about what the solutions could look like to mitigate those risks, and as well talk about what the opportunities look like. The few small, simple, agile steps now, a little bit of common sense planning and thinking, I think Australia can position itself as a regional leader, if not perhaps more so. Like we've said earlier today, Australia has a financial services framework that punches well above its weight globally. We have a banking system and players that do very much the same thing, often ranking within the top 10 to 15. And if we just take a nod from what's come before, what works really well, and implement it with this new opportunity in front of us, I think we can see the ROI and reap the rewards for many decades to come. So, Senator, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here today. Senator Dastyari.
Look, thank you so much for having me. I normally begin by saying something very nice about my colleagues that are in the room, and we've got Senator Cannavan here, And what I'd normally say is that Senator Canavan and I come from extremely different backgrounds, and the fact that we can see eye to eye on this issue is pretty significant. You know, with Senator Canavan, you have a National Party senator from rural Queensland. With me, you have an inner city wog from Sydney. And if the two of us can see the importance and the significance of an issue, then that's normally a good sign. That's what I'd normally say. But I have a bone to pick with Senator Canavan, and that is that unfortunately Senator Canavan actually knows what he's talking about, and the rest of us massively get the shits because it makes the rest of us look really stupid. Ron, thank you so much for having us here today. Thank you for hosting this evening. Ron is many things. He's incredibly talented. He's incredibly passionate. His kind of energy is really infectious, and it's really got what me excited about this issue. He's also the best dressed man that I've ever met. And people don't actually know this about Ron, but after a few drinks in Sydney, he once told me his secret. Most people don't know this. Prior to his time with Bitcoin, he was actually a fashion tycoon back in the day. And I think the Bitcoin thing is just a ploy to become wealthy enough to get back into designer fashion, which is where his heart and talent really lies. Look, what I wanted to talk about today was really what I see as the two challenges. What I see as our challenge as policymakers, and what I see as your challenge in terms of the actual community in Australia. And by saying that, I think we can't underestimate just the enormous opportunity that we have here in the Australian context. The enormous opportunity. And the opportunity really rests in the fact that there is actually so little information and understanding out there about the potential of this for Australia. You know, when we were passing this matter through the Senate, so for those, I won't bore you with Senate procedure because it's pretty dull, but the idea behind this was that we wanted to get bipartisan support. We didn't want this to be controversial. So it had to go through the Labor Party room, had to go through the Conservative Party room, had to kind of go through the Senate committee, make sure everyone was on board, because the last thing you want is you don't actually get change in this country by having a kind of contentious policy framework. And we wanted to make sure it was as bipartisan as possible, so we went through this whole process. And as it was being passed in the Senate, one of the older senators from my side of politics, who's very distinguished, very well established, comes up to me and goes, Sam, this all sounds really interesting, but why on earth are we doing a Senate inquiry into Coinbits? And it made me realise just the depth of the gap of the understanding between where we are and where the political class is really at. And what I want to stress is that's kind of our opportunity, and that's the exciting opportunity that we have, that we can actually go out there, shape it, define it, and hopefully, I mean, let's be clear about what the hope here is. We want to go through a Senate process where we go through an open inquiry. I think our first day of hearings is going to be on the 26th of November. Go through a Senate inquiry, have open public hearings, have the debate out there in the public forum, and hopefully, at the end of the process, be able to reach a series of unanimous recommendations on how we can make this implement a regulatory framework around this that actually allows the business and the industry to grow and allows Australia to be the world leaders in this space. That's not a small task, it's a huge task, but we have an incredible opportunity that we can't and should not waste. Now that's the obligation of us in the political sense, on our side of the fence, which is really how do we create the right regulatory framework? How do we address the legitimate concerns that different government agencies have around this space? How do we build an industry and a marketing and a job opportunity here for Australians? How do we really grow the Bitcoin space here in Australia? And at the same time, address some of the very legitimate concerns around security, around banking, around certainty, some of the stuff that Senator Canavan addressed quite eloquently earlier. That's the political challenge, and that's the policy challenge that we need to be working on, and we've created a process to work on. What I would call in the Bitcoin community to help us achieve that is also addressing the elements of the Bitcoin community. And I get emails and phone calls and contact and this and that, who see regulation and government somehow as being part of the enemy. This idea that we've created this free, open space, this free economy, and the last thing we need is government and regulation to get involved. Now, my point always is that you get involved in shaping regulation because otherwise regulation shapes you. It's not going to go away. It's not going to be able to be worked around unless you're part of that process. And where I call on you guys in the Bitcoin community is a little bit of pushback would help with those elements within the Bitcoin community who turn around and look at what we're trying to do here in Australia and say, well, hang on, we don't want to be regulated. We don't want a policy response. We don't want a policy approach. We want to stay as this kind of free shadow space on the internet because somehow that conforms to our idea of freedom and independence and separation from government. That isn't a workable system. That's not a sustainable system. That's not a system that's going to create jobs and opportunities and a business and an industry in the future. It's created when people like yourselves, people like Ron, people like all of you in this room get involved, participate in the process, help us who are the policymakers in a bipartisan, cross-party way, develop a framework that creates the job, the economic and the policy opportunities for this industry to grow in this country. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for participating in all of this. I think it's interesting that, obviously this is being held in concurrence with the G20 events. And what you've got down the road has been a series of old politicians talking about the economic past and talking about how to deal with the past problems in the future. And there's nothing wrong with that, and they certainly should be doing that. But at the same time, you've got here running concurrently, talking about the future, talking about the new opportunities, talking about the new potential. And I think what's really exciting for us in the political space is to be able to be part of this discussion, to be able to be part of this journey. I think both Senator Canavan and I would have actually loved to have been able to be part of the discussion here tomorrow, especially since you're focusing on that kind of regulatory space, which is obviously where we're involved in. Unfortunately, both of us have Senate sitting tomorrow, so we've actually got to head back to Canberra. But thank you so much for having us, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to have a beer and have a bit of an informal conversation with all of you tonight.